Let's first talk about what soil is and how it's produced. Soil is a complex mixture of weathered rock, minerals, and organic material, both living and decaying, and water and air. Different soils have different amounts. What kind of things might change the amounts of organic material or weathered rock or water or air, do you think? Well, things like, of course, the location and the type of area that you are in is going to dictate that. The type of rock below you is going to dictate that. We note that on average, though, soil has the following ratios: about 45% minerals and rocks, about 25% water, 25% air, and about 5% organic material. Soil is essentially produced from the weathering of rocks and minerals. Deposits of sediment are washed or blown to the area to produce soil, and living things decompose material to produce soil. Let's specifically look at how soil is formed through the process of weathering. Weathering is a physical or chemical breakdown of rock into smaller pieces. The pieces may be large or even too small to see, and there's two types of weathering: chemical weathering and mechanical weathering. Chemical weathering shown in the picture on the left, mechanical on the right. Mechanical weathering is a physical breakdown of rocks. The chemical composition of the rock doesn't change, but it just breaks into smaller and smaller pieces, and the more pieces you have, the easier it breaks down. Types of mechanical weathering include exfoliation, ice wedging, abrasion, and plant and animal activity. Exfoliation is when you have rocks that come to the surface, perhaps through erosion, and pressure is released from them. As the pressure is released, they actually crack and break into layers like onions. And the rocks break apart and flow into the areas below. You can see a picture of this surface of granite exfoliating as it's reached the surface. It cracked to form joints and breaks apart to form layers. Ice wedging is another form of mechanical weathering in which water trickles down into the spaces between rock layers, and at night, or when the water gets to a point where it freezes, it actually expands up to 10% when it freezes. And as a result, that freezing of water is a very powerful force that expands outward and cracks and breaks rock. Abrasion is another form of mechanical weathering in which little grains are basically smashed into one another, and as they collide, they break into even more smaller pieces or rounded out areas. Abrasion happens because of gravity, ice, running water, or wind, but all forms of abrasion are mechanical weathering. Plant and animal activity also breaks up rocks physically. Plant roots act like ice to split rocks. And animals, mostly the ones that burrow, expose other rocks for further weathering. Chemical weathering involves the chemical reaction to break minerals down that are in the interiors of the rock, and it really produces different materials. Types of chemical weathering include oxidation, hydrolysis, carbonation, organic acids, and acid rain. Pictured here is what the Statue of Liberty might look like if she hadn't weathered chemically. Oxidation is essentially rusting. When elements combine with oxygen, they break off as new compounds and form rusty, iron-rich, especially iron-rich rocks will form rusty sort of soils. So you can see the red soils here in the picture in the countryside here. This is oxidized soil. Much of the soil in the south of our country is oxidized, and you'll see lots of red soils. The Red River is not called the Red River just because it's red because of the red soils that appear in Oklahoma and Texas, for example. Hydrolysis is another type of chemical weathering in which chemicals in the rock react with water, causing some of the minerals to break away from the rock and form new minerals altogether. Rocks that are rich in potassium and aluminum, will react with water to produce different forms of clay, and thus breaking the rock down chemically. Carbonation is when water that mixes with carbon dioxide, producing a little kind of a very weak acid called carbonic acid, eats away at the rock. This particularly happens with limestone rock. The acid can stick to some of the minerals and form compounds that are washed away by the water. Caves and caverns are the result of carbonation. Organic acids are where some living things produce acids to dissolve the minerals in the rock for nutrients, and as a result, the rocks are weathered chemically. Examples include lichens and mosses. Acid rain, of course, is another form of chemical weathering where pollutants from fossil fuels get in the air and combine with rainwater to form rapid weathering, more so than normal rain, on landscapes. An example of a situation where an acid rain was particularly at fault here is the Cleopatra's Needle. If you see Cleopatra's Needle, a beautiful obelisk from Egypt, it lasted from 1450 BC to about 1880, and there's a picture of it there in Egypt, lasting for hundreds and hundreds of years there in Egypt in the dry conditions. When brought to New York in 1880, in 100 years, it weathered to the point where you see it there in the picture. The water, ample water, along with chemicals within the water, worked to wear that thing down like no other, and produced a really terrible weathering of this beautiful ancient material. So let's discuss the characteristics of soil, different types and formations. When new rock is exposed, soil begins to form. Of course, new rock is exposed as bedrock to weathering, and the weathering process breaks down that rock into soil particles. Bedrock begins to break into smaller rocks through mechanical and chemical weathering processes. These smaller rocks are known as regolith. The top of the regolith is weathered even more, producing smaller particles that begin to form pebbles, and eventually those pebbles form smaller grains, and those smaller grains form even smaller grains, and soil begins to develop. Sediments from water or wind may add to the soil, and organic material begins to add to the soil as well. Mineral particles include regolith, sand, silt, and clay. Organic matter in the soil includes humus, which is decaying organics, roots, and organisms. And of course, air and water are also part of the soil. The main characteristic of a soil is determined by the bedrock that it sits atop. That's called the parent material. Iron-rich volcanic rock from Hawaii, for example, will produce iron-rich sand grains. Granite rock and sandy soils in Colorado National Monument will produce the brownish soil, sandy soils you see resulting from the rock formations. So the parent material can affect the soil texture and color. And quartz-rich rocks produce sandy soil. Iron-rich rocks produce red soil. The size of the soil particles also affects the characteristics of a soil. Soils are usually categorized by the amount of each type of particle that they have, and the three types of particles are clay, silt, and sand. Clay, of course, is the finest grained particles, and sand the coarsest or biggest. Sand particles, you can tell because if you put it in between your fingers, it's really gritty. Silt is kind of smooth with a little grit, and clay, when rubbed between the two fingers, is very smooth. That's how you can kind of tell from just using your fingers. But of course, these have sizes associated with them as well. When you mix the different types of soil, clay, and silt together, you get all the different soil types. And of course, this is actually there's a whole science to this. But essentially, you can get 6 major types of soil: peaty soil, loamy soil, sandy soil, chalky soil, clay soil, and silty soil. And again, the term loam is used as a mixture of clay, silt, and sand. And different percentages make different types of soil. Let's look at how we study soils through soil profiles and horizons. The formation of soil in different areas produces different layers. These layers are called horizons. You're looking at a picture here with several soil horizons. It's like somebody took a knife, a big knife, giant knife, and cut a big square out of the earth like a piece of cake and pulled it out to take a look at its yummy layers to the side. The composition and depth of horizons is measured by looking at these soil profiles, which is a side view of the soil. The different horizons or layers of the soil start at the top with the O horizon. It's kind of its own little layer where it's just basically made of plant debris, leaves, branches, and animal waste. It's the organics. It's of course then brown or black in color. The next horizon is called the topsoil, and the topsoil is a mixture of decomposing organic matter called humus and small soil particles from the bedrock. Topsoil contains most plant roots and soil organisms when looking at the different profiles. The B horizon is the subsoil. It's a transitional layer of parent material and organic material. Minerals that are leached from the A horizon are usually present in the B horizon, and then of course a lot of chunks of the weathered parent rock are in the B horizon. Now I use the term leaching. Leaching is when water reacts with minerals in the upper soil layers and carries them down to the lower layers. In this case, mostly B horizons are the deposition place for leached minerals. And here's a picture showing leaching. Rainwater comes down and infiltrates or leaches through the ground, absorbing minerals from the A horizon and dropping them off on the B horizon. Our next layer would be the C horizon, and this is generally composed of a lot of regolith, which is the partially weathered rock chunks from the bedrock. It doesn't usually have any organic material because we're pretty far down at this point, and maybe 4 feet down or more. And below the C horizon is bedrock, and this is where the parent material for the soil lies. Now, different soil profiles, of course, have different thicknesses. The soil around our area, the temperate soil, is very thick in its layers and horizons, and as a result, you have to dig down pretty far to get to bedrock in most cases. Let's look at the different types of soils. Tropical, desert, and temperate are the main types. Climate is a very important factor in soil formation and type. Climate creates a varying thickness and mineral content in the horizons. You can see pictured here some global soil regions. In general, the one more specific one on the right, or excuse me, on the left here, and then some of the more general areas of soil on the right. You can see that you have polar soils and temperate soils and tropical soils and arid or desert soils. Let's start first with tropical soils. Tropical soils have large amounts of rain that leach minerals from the upper layers to the B horizon, which makes the B horizon very thick in tropical soils. It also makes the A horizon pretty small. In fact, a lot of the rain washes away the topsoil. So you usually have a thin A horizon and a thick B horizon. Tropical soils have a name they refer to. They're called laterites. We don't have a lot of mechanical weathering in tropical soils. Why do you think that is? Well, because it's listed there. The answer: no temperature changes, and the decomposition is high because there's lots of water in the soil. And so tropical soils are characteristic because of their climate and the associated climate that they have in there. I don't think the soil will be very good for farming because most of the layers are either most of the nutrients that you would find in the A horizon that you would need for farming are either washed away by the rains or leached down into the lower layers because of the infiltration of water. Desert and Arctic soils have very little rainfall, and so there's almost no chemical weathering involved with these soils. There's really a lot of mechanical freeze-thaw weathering or wet-dry cycles that produce cracking and breaking of the bedrock below and the weathering of the regolith. There's little life in these soils, so there's not much organic material, and soil is mostly regolith in these areas because of the fact that it's just chunks of weathered bedrock. And maybe just a little O stuff at the top, a little organic material at the top for a small O horizon. Desert soils are referred to as pedicels. Temperate soils are the ones we live in. They have varying seasons in temperate areas, which provides all kinds of weathering. So there's lots of life, there's lots of organic material, and the soils in these areas are usually deeply developed and usually have all 4 layers and are very thick. Temperate soils then are referred to as pedifers. And here's a comparison of the 3 types of soils: your wet climate laterites, your dry climate pedicels, and your temperate climate pedifers. You can see the thick B horizons and the laterites, the mostly large chunks of regolith in the pedicels, and kind of thin A and B horizons, and then the nice thick well-developed A, B, and C horizons in the pedifers. Let's talk soil erosion and conservation, how we can try to control the amount of or reduce the amount of erosion from soil. What is erosion? Erosion is the movement of weathered materials from one location to another. It's not the same as weathering in that weathering helps build up the soil. Erosion removes the soil. Causes of soil erosion include gravity, water, glaciers, wind, and human action. Gravity erosion is pictured here. It's a good example of it. Gravity erosion is when, of course, material moves downslope. We call masses of material moving downslope mass movements, creatively enough. And mass movements include things like, as you see pictured in the bottom left there, landslides, dip flows, and even soil creep, the small, slow movement of soil over time. Rapid mass movements are classified as falls, which are self-explanatory, slides, where large masses of rock move together all at once, either in a flat plane, which we call transverse slides, or in a rotational sense, which we call rotational slides. You can see a rotational slide head there on the picture in the middle on the right. And flows. Rapid mass movements include a material that actually moves like water. It can be wet or dry, but if it moves like water, it's called a flow. And it's named after the type of material that's flowing. You can have a debris flow or a mud flow, etc. Pictured in the lower right there is a debris flow deposit in the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. An example of a rapid mass movement was in Vajont, Italy, the Vajont Reservoir in Italy in 1963. This was a translational slide, so the mass of material moved all at once together in a consolidated mass that slid in a flat plane. In this case, it slid down a valley slope into a reservoir. The dam was built across the Vajont Valley in northwestern Italy to produce water usage for the area towns, and weak clay layers, fractures between the layers, an old fault system, and heavy rains weakened everything. And in 1963, at 10:41 p.m. on October 9th, the south wall of the valley failed and 240 million cubic meters of material slid into the reservoir behind the dam. You can see the mass of material pictured in the bottom left and the bottom right there. As the slide moved into the reservoir, it caused the water in the dam that was behind the dam to wash upstream and kill 1,000 people, and of course down and up and over the dam downstream to kill 2,000 people. This event is often then referred to as the world's biggest dam disaster. Yes, that was a joke. Water erosion is where water moves material. You can see a picture of example of this here. Running water is the most active agent of erosion. It breaks up and rounds out grains through water abrasion. It carves out V-shaped valleys, and it leaves behind thick deposits at the mouths of rivers, either at the bottom of a mountainside, as you see pictured in the bottom right there, and those are called alluvial fans. That's when the water slows down so all the sediment it's carrying is dropped. And the same thing can happen when the river hits a large body of water. The moving river hits the body of water and slows way down, causing the sediment to be dropped to form a wedge-shaped deposit called a delta. Pictured in the middle right is the Nile Delta. Glaciers also cause erosion. They pick up and move sediment from very small varieties all the way up to large boulders. Glaciers, of course, are masses of moving ice. Because they are moving downstream or downslope, the ice actually does move and flow. They can be up to a mile thick. They scratch up, break up, and crush rock into flour, or they can actually pluck up big boulders and carry them for hundreds of thousands of miles. They cut out large U-shaped valleys and leave behind sharp peaks and ridges, and can even create large lakes. Examples: the Great Lakes are thought to be caused and carved out by glaciers. Glaciers also leave behind huge amounts of sediment. When they melt and start to recede, they'll drop the things they're carrying, and that causes large hills to be formed. Those are called moraines, large hills of jumbled clay to boulder-sized material that are dropped by glaciers. And oftentimes the wind will blow over and across the top of glaciers, picking up even only the finest grained particles, and that wind-blown silt is laid down wind by the motion of the wind, producing large deposits and thick deposits of the material called loess. Pictured in the bottom right, you can see loess deposits and their thicknesses all over different areas of the U.S. From the last glaciations. Lastly today, wind erosion. Wind erosion is significant and has caused significant damage and destruction throughout history. Wind picks up the smallest grains and it leaves behind then larger grains, so the area then is deflated from the small grains. It actually ends up making the area look pretty craggly and kind of like a lunar surface almost. Wind, of course, causes wind abrasion. It makes very rounded out rocks because of the slamming of rocks by the moving air carrying sediment. Rocks then get very smoothed out. They're called ventifacts. And of course leaves behind dunes. Pictured in the lower right, it can also cause large dust storms, which can be very damaging. One particular period in our U.S. history where we had large dust storms was in the 1930s. Was called the Dust Bowl, and it was when, because of the Great Depression, people started trying to farm the Great Plains, and when the land was stripped to form crops, there was a big drought. No crops formed, the soil was exposed, the winds picked up the soil and created bad dust storms. This is called the Dust Bowl. So an example of wind erosion at its worst. So how do humans affect soil erosion? Well, developments for housing and buildings expose soil. Farming exposes a lot of loose soil to erosion, and you lose a lot of the O and A horizons, which contain most of the organic material in the soil. The plants and animals need that to survive. There's a lot of areas around the world that have some concern or serious concern from soil erosion. You can see pictured here some of those areas. So what can we do to prevent erosion? Well, pictured here are some events that are some some things that we can do to prevent soil erosion. We'll talk about these. First off, contour plowing. Contour plowing is where the hillsides are plowed in curves that follow the shape of the land, and this helps to keep the soil from running down the sides of hill slopes. Strip cropping is another way we can conserve soil. Strip cropping involves planting crops in alternating bands, and this way the whole area is not filled with row crops that don't cover all the land and conserve soil for future farming. Terracing is one way that areas that are very mountainous can still have crops form, and basically the hills are carved into flat steps and prevents water from flowing rapidly down the hill. It conserves the soil and allows for agriculture. Crop rotation is another, where planting a crop to harvest one year and one to leave in place for next year helps to conserve the soil and allow it to be used for many years to come. Crop rotation is often combined with strip cropping and contour farming in order to help make the best use of an area's land.